this is a relatively, I don't make much of it in the slides, but I think it's actually, if you understand this point, then you understand not just what I'm talking about now, but you also understand what we were talking about in the first part 1 of the lectures, where we talked about reconsolidation. And that's a concept I really want you to know. So know this point is that we can, if we think about consolidation, if you think about the reconstruction of memory, you can relate this back to the reconsolidation, in that so we're using our past experiences, we're reconstructing our memories online, we're bringing in information that we think is consistent with previous schemas and previous information, and we're often having a difficult time attributing where we got that information from. One of the potential reasons for this, and it is still potential, but one of the potential reasons for this is the reconsolidation, is the fact that every time that we remember an event, what we're doing is we're bringing it out of archives, out of long-term memory, and bring it back into working memory, bring it back onto the desk so that we can use it. And that every time it's brought back onto the desk, and this is the part that I find particularly interesting, but is that that is now an opportunity not just to remember it better, which is what you might expect would happen, but also to forget it again. And the analogy I used in the last video was that you can bring something back out of archives, but that's now actually an opportunity to misfile it again. It needs to go back into archives again. It needs to get refiled. And if it doesn't get refiled, it can actually get lost. And so you can think about it not just in terms of lost, think about lost in a slightly more subtle sense. So it's not just that you either remember it or you don't remember it, but you can misremember. You can misattribute. You can forget the source. You can add some extra information in. You can lose a little bit, etc., etc. All of these errors of omission and commission that we're talking about may be related to, are likely related to, but may be quite heavily related to this, the fact that when we remember information, we're actually taking it out of archives, re-remembering it again, and giving us an opportunity not just to strengthen it, but to actually weaken, misfile, misremember, forget the memory. Okay, next slide. I already talked about constructive nature of memory. Again, won't go through that any further. Okay, so then a relatively small point here, but a small point about the technical versus the content accuracy of memories, which is related also to the gist or the details of a memory. So I mentioned that over time we often lose the details. War of the Ghosts demonstrated this, right? That over time the details start to fade, but the memory for the story itself remained. And the broad concepts remained, maybe changed, started to change, broken telephoned along, but the details began to fade. And so we sometimes refer to that as that the details were forgotten, but the gist was remembered. So gist memory tends to have a longer memory trace, even though it has less details, sort of by definition. So technical versus content accuracy is really quite similar to that. And the technical accuracy is, were they technically accurate? Were they exactly accurate about a given piece of information? Content accuracy is, did they accurately remember the content of the sentences? So, so I can in the Bob's hammer example, it's probably a good one. Was hammer included? Well, people say the people that said yes were wrong, and so they're technically not accurate. But in terms of giving an accurate indication, an accurate remembrance of the story itself, of the vignette, of what happened, of the importance of it, of the meaning of what Bob was trying to do, they can remember that just fine, ostensibly. We'll say they did in this case. That would be a difference between technical versus content accuracy. Would also be a difference between the details versus the gist of a story. So if you're remembering the gist, you're kind of remembering the content, but not the technical features of it. The reason this is important for two reasons. One is just important to recognize that there are these distinctions between the two, and that our memories often work to allow the gist, the content, to continue on. The memory trace remains stronger for that than for the technical accuracy. But there's a reason for that if you think about it. There's rarely a reason to remember the technical features of a piece of information, of an event, of whatever. Who cares whether hammer was in that vignette or not, right? Who cares if hammer, the word hammer, actually came out? We all know what Bob was doing. He was pounding nails. He was using a hammer, right? We all know that. And that's the important thing. And the reason that's important is because that's the type of information we need to be able to understand, to build schemas, to build scripts, to understand how we should act in that if we were with Bob at the time, anything. The gist is really what we want to get most of the time. And so it's both not surprising and also quite adaptive that our memory systems actually do work in that way. Our memory systems work to give us the gist as a heuristic. It's a heuristic aspect of memory, and it's quite adaptive so that we don't get bogged down by the details we don't need. All we normally need is the gist. As a bit of an aside, I'll just note that actually recognize that you guys all here. I'll try to give a little bit of a rationalization for what you guys interpret to be quite hard tests that I give. I know you guys interpret my test as being hard. I'll see if I can rationalize a little bit. One of the reasons that you find it hard is because okay, I won't say. So that doesn't. You're not going to get tested on this part. This is my own little diatribe going off now. But I'll give my little rationalization since it popped into my head. Is when you're giving rote memorization, when you read the textbook and you're trying to remember definitions, you're trying to remember what was said, you're trying to remember paragraphs, and the professor gives you the exact paragraph or pretty much the exact paragraph that's in the text, and you have to remember whether it was there. That's remembering the technical aspect of things. My tests tend not to test you as much on the technical aspect of things. I mean, give you some questions on the technical aspect. In fact, probably half the exam is still technical in nature, but the other half is just in nature. The other half is I want you to understand the concept. I want you to understand why. And the reason for that is because that's the really important information. Who cares whether hammer was actually in the sentence or not, right? Who cares of the exact wording the textbook used, as long as you understand the concept. The second is, it's the concept, it's the content, it's the gist that continues on in your memory. It's the gist that has longevity. And so it's no surprise. I mean, I know you guys don't like it because in a real short-term sense, you can memorize the textbook and remember the specific technical detail for a short period of time. And in fact, Jacobi's famous overnight experiment demonstrates that as long as you haven't, like within 24 hours, your memory for those technical aspects is very good. But give yourself 24 hours or 48 hours or whatever the length of time would be, and those technical aspects fade. And if you don't have the concepts down, it fades completely. If you do have the concepts down, that's the memory that lasts over time. Anyway, I know half of you are rolling your eyes at me, and I know half of you are just like, just let us do well on the exams. But I'm not doing it to be stupid. I'm not doing it to be tough. Exactly. I'm doing it because I care, and because I have a teaching, because I understand some of these things, and I know that I can test you in a way that will allow you guys to do well, but you'll lose it. And you know that's what happens. You know you lose it. So I want you to remember it. So anyway, enough of my diatribe. I should continue on because, again, I think I've got guests coming in about 15 minutes. So I'd like to finish this. I don't know that I will anymore. Okay, next slide, technical versus content accuracy, which is more important. Sort of already talked about this a little bit. What I'll just note is that I've sort of emphasized that the content is more important and gone off on a bit of a diatribe about that. That, of course, is not always the case. An example here in the bottom of the slide would be eyewitness testimony. I mean, there are, of course, times Another would be tests in some other classes. Right? There are times when the technical nature of things really is important. If you're understanding how to build a computer, you got to be pretty damn technical. The gist isn't going to get you by in that case. So to some extent, it's contextual, and it depends on the situation. Sometimes technical is more important. Sometimes content is more important. But in the general, in life, and we're talking about everyday memories in this lecture. In everyday memories in life, and how should I act in a given situation, the gist tends to be more important. The content tends to be more important. And that is how our brains work, not surprisingly. Okay, but that does lead to problems. The fact that we get the gist, if we remembered the technical aspect of things, if we remembered the details, these errors of omission and commission that we're talking about, these sins that Daniel Schachter talks about, these 7 sins, wouldn't happen, or at least wouldn't happen as much, or at least wouldn't happen in the same way. So it's great that our brains work this way, and it's very adaptive most of the time, but it does lead to the everyday errors that we're talking about today. One of these errors, power of suggestion. Okay. And so the misinformation effect is that misleading information presented after a person witnesses an event can change how the person describes the event later. So there's been a lot of work done on this. And in fact, this work, you probably know some of this work. It comes up in Psych 100. It also comes up in eyewitness testimony. So in our forensic psychology program in particular, you probably come across this a lot. But so I won't go into it. I'll go relatively quickly. But Elizabeth Loftus is probably the most famous person for this, studied work on eyewitness testimony, and what she would try to do is add in an MPI, referred to here as a misleading post-event information. So after the event, they give a little bit more information and see if that changes your original memory for the event. Okay, and so an example of this is I'm going to go, okay, it looks like I've got a couple of examples here. I'm going to skip the first one. I'm going to go down to the one with the figures of the cars. They're both in your textbook. Okay, but participants here watched a video of a car accident. They then had to answer questions about the accident. So they watched a video of a regular car accident. They then answered questions about it, and they answered questions, and the question contained the word, either it was do you remember the cars either hitting, smashing, colliding, bumping, or contacting another car. Okay, and 1 week, so that was the question, and that was actually the misinformation that was given, was that either the word hit, smashed, contacted, collided, bumped, whatever was put in. 1 week later, you'll notice that this is the exact same design as the famous people experiment that Jacobi did. Exact same design, really the exact same effect, but so worth recognizing that what we're really talking about, this is the same type of thing. 1 week later, instead of 24 hours later in the Jacobi experiment, participants are asked, did you see broken glass? Okay. Did you see a hammer? Was there a hammer in Bob's story? All sort of the same thing. And what you can see is that the percent of people saying yes differed depending on whether people were told that people were asked whether the cars smashed into each other. People were asked if they hit each other. If they were told that they were smashed, then more people say they saw broken glass in the video, which is a misattribution. The difference, the specific effect that is important here is the MPI. So recognize that what's being given here is the misleading post-event information. Okay, so what this is demonstrating is this is different than the schemas. Okay, it's the opposite direction.